playing some Sicilians. Now I'm going to play c5 here. I think the Sicilian is a pretty reasonable choice. I would say that in general, at the absolute beginner level, we're around 700 thus far. Either e5, c5, or c6 are really the only three moves that I see as being acceptable. Now we get the move bishop c4. Now there are many different setups, and one of the setups that I'm going to showcase today is this move e6. Now if my opponent had played the move knight to f3, I was actually intending to play e6 anyway, but it's even better here because after this move bishop c4, when I go pawn to e6, there are no longer any threats towards this pawn on f7 via f3 or h5 here, as this pawn will stand in the way of any threats. So we play the move pawn to e6. Now let's see what our opponent chooses to do here. We get the move knight to f3, and now I'm simply going to play the very calm move knight to c6. Now even without bishop c4, if white had played knight to f3, I still would have done the same thing with e6 and knight c6. We get d4. I will take with the pawn here. Very important to note that in the Sicilian, when you trade pawns on d4, you almost never want to do a double trade where you trade the pawn off and then trade a knight or a bishop, for example, off for the knight. So we trade the pawns off. We're happy with this. And now the move that I'm going to play is this move a6. Now the opening itself is not an opening that necessarily is a beginner opening, but the danger when you play these openings, specifically these systems with e6, is that very easily there's some dark square weaknesses here. If white could get a knight to d6, or say white could get knight b5, my arrows are bad, with the idea of bishop to f4 and then knight c7 or knight e6, again there could be some issues. So the move I'm going to play is a6, stopping any of these knight b5, knight d6, or knight c7 ideas. Additionally, the pawn on e6 also stops knight from going to f5 as well here, so white trades knight. Now in many cases when they're captured, usually it applies to double pawns, but just in general you always want to capture towards the center. Now by the center we're referring to this e file here with all these squares, and the D file as well. Generally, both the E and the D files constitute the center. So I could capture away from the center. Where I take with this pawn is towards the edge of the board, towards this side. But what I'm going to do is take with this pawn, and this is capturing towards the center here, towards the E and towards the D file here. This capture will also support the pawn thrust to D5 with both the pawns guarding. So I'm not sure if I explained that super well. Basically the center is the E file or the D file. Everything else you could say like the F file, maybe it's kind of a bit of the center of the C file, but generally the center is considered to be these two files. So when I capture this way, the pawn is aiming towards the center. It wants to get to the D or the E file here, whereas if I take with this pawn, it would be aiming towards the edge of the board, which would be these three files. So I hope I explained that better. Maybe I didn't. At any rate, you guys will let me know in the comments. So we get the move bishop to E3. Now the move I'm going to play here is d5. Now you'll notice here that I have this nice big set of pawns here. I've got the big black center here, but additionally now I can take and I will develop all my pieces behind this chain of pawns with knight to f6, bishop d6, and castles. Now I am a touch behind in development, so I do have to be a little bit careful here, but this center more than makes up for the lack of development because I'm really only one move behind. I need 1, 2, 3. The king is very safe here behind all these pawns. So without white being able to attack and take advantage of my lack of development, I should be doing very well. So we'll develop the knight here. Really for choice, I could develop the knight, I could develop the bishop, doesn't really matter which one. They're both completely fine. Now I am going to follow this up with bishop to d6 and then castling my king out of the center. We get bishop g5. Now this does temporarily pin the knight, but you'll notice here that there is an imbalance where I have these pawns in the center. Now if white had a pawn on e4, and I'll just pick up this pawn to illustrate, if white could put this pawn on e5 here, for example, this would be a big issue as it would pin the knight and white could win the knight. But here white has no pawn on the e file. There's no pawn available to try and get to this e5 square. So because there's no pawn to get to the square, even though the knight is pinned by the bishop, it's not really that big of a deal. Now there are a couple of options here that I could play. If I were playing a professional game, I would put the bishop on d6, but what I'm going to do is put the bishop on e7 simply to break this pin so that now the knight is free to move and I won't lose my queen. We got bishop a4. I will simply block with the bishop, offering the trade. I will pre-move, queen takes bishop. And now my next idea is to finish development with castles. Now this is a pretty slow game so far. Not a whole lot has happened. What we're about to see is why having the center is a little bit better here for black, because white will be unable to attack the center. And additionally here I have a couple of open files for the rook, very specifically on the C and the B file. Remember, rooks belong on open files. So I'm going to put my rook here, target this pawn on B2. You will also notice that after I put the rook on C8, These pawns in the center are very well guarded. White has this big weakness on c2, and there's just no way to get after the pawns here. So I'm really going to try to put pressure on this pawn on c2. It's not the only pressure point here. This is actually a big mistake, because after takes, White has a huge problem with this rook. It cannot slide over to either b1 or c1 here, so we get to move c3. Now, I'm simply going to look at this position very carefully. Remember, we're out of the opening phase of the game. Now, you'll notice that I can win the pawn here. You might be thinking, well, why take the pawn? White hasn't finished development. Now, that would be a valid point. However, usually when you talk about a lack of development and pieces coming into the game, that involves the king specifically being stuck in the center. The king here for White is castled, so if I don't take this pawn, White sooner or later will develop. There's really no big attack here. I don't have to take the pawn, but I am going to capture it in this situation, primarily because it is a free pawn here. Everything is guarded. I'll look closely. King guards the pawns. Rook isn't under attack. This pawn isn't under attack. Everything is safe. So now I have an extra pawn in the center, and I'm going to line up a double or a triple stack and take over the only open file on the board here. You'll notice there are no other completely open files except for this one C file, and luckily my rook and my queen, everything can use it. So we get rook c1. Now here I could play rook c8, but the move that I'm going to play is queen c7, allowing the trade of the rooks. Main reason I'm putting the queen here as opposed to the rook is that after White trades the rooks, that's just a blunder. That's just a free rook. I have 1-2 guarding. Queen's under attack. This will be GG. A little bit premature ending to this game. Not what I was hoping for. I take the queen here. Don't want to have a mouse slip. I will go rook to c8, lining up the double stack, infiltrating with the rook and the queen here. Eventually, I'm going to try to checkmate from behind with the queen and the rook, and this looks pretty good for me. You'll also notice that White has no way to create a back rank checkmate here. My king is walled in by the pawns, but this rook cannot get to any of these squares to check the king. So we get the move a4. So now I'm going to go queen g1. I'm going to go after this pawn on g2 and try to end the game as quickly as possible. I will point out, since I do believe the names are blurred on the accounts we're playing, we are very close to a 700 level. Most of these opening videos, I would say, for the next 200 points or so are going to be pretty similar along these lines of of drilling these habits into you about the development, making sure everything is protected, castling your king out of the center. These are going to be the basic principles, in addition to basically focusing on the pawn structure and not getting cheesed at the start of the game. Once we get to about 1000 level, I think it's going to start to change a little bit. Mostly what I'm going to try to do, though, is showcase some of these different opening setups so you see different strategies and different pawn structures. So my opponent is thinking here and or potentially going to end the game. Very similar to the last video. The last game that I played, my opponent started stalling out towards the end. I don't know if my opponent in this case is doing that, but it is definitely a possibility. Wish I had something instructive to say while we wait, but unfortunately I don't have anything much to say here. Just trying to finish off this game as quickly as possible. I think here I'm going to pre-move rook takes g2. It's not the only move that I can play here, but it seems like a pretty safe pre-move. Let's see what my opponent chooses to do. Try not to turn into a statue here, obviously, for those of you guys who are watching the video. But because my opponent has not made a move, there's just not much more to explain. This could be an issue. I think as we get further into the speed run, this won't be such a big deal. But the second game in a row where this has happened, I don't know if this means my opponent has looked at the account and has seen that this is an authorized speedrun account, or if my opponent is simply just sulking and trying to figure out why he's so outclassed in this game. We might have to sit here for another 3.5 minutes. That would be very disappointing if that is the case. It is one thing I would say, actually, is when you do play online, definitely it's important at least to have some bit. Oh, my opponent abandoned the game. This is the second time in a row where this has happened, where my opponent has chosen to disconnect when they